Good morning, persons of quality, but I suppose if you can tell by the clock behind me, it would be just as apropos to say good afternoon. So, chapter 3 of Their Eyes Were Watching God, just a further development of what it is that you've been working on reading. Now, certainly by tomorrow, you need to have read chapters 3 and 4. Already gave that to you as weekend homework, but certainly this is something you want to focus on moving forward. So, to begin, again, that quote at the beginning of the chapter is always significantly important. There are years that ask questions and years that answer them. Janie had no chance to know things, so she had to ask. I know I added the word them to the first part of that quote, but regardless, the text seems to be certainly guiding as we're building Janie's story. So this is where she's married to Logan Killicks, and she finds herself very much empty inside, missing something significant. Good thing, too, is that chapter 3 was relatively short. So as I was looking at the notes, I found it very significant that early in chapter 3, she talks about returning to the pear tree. Now, you go back to what we did in chapters 1 and 2, specifically with that pear tree, and you say, what is it about that element of nature? What is it about what the pear tree certainly does for Janie, or how it inspires, or however you want to say that? So in my notes, I wrote, explain how the image, or at least the return to the image in chapter 3, is important. Write it in your notes. Make sure that you have it specifically so you can talk intelligently about this chapter and where it goes. Again, it's a romantic idea, this presence of nature, and why it's significant, I think, is very important to your notes. I think another really interesting comment that comes out of this section is the idea that Nanny talks about Logan Killicks and his 60 acres. So Killicks has land, which means he has wealth, which means that this is a good match from Nanny's perspective and from Killick's perspective. So I think it's a very significant idea that he has that 60 acres of land. This certainly gives us the opportunity to discuss this vision of love and what it meant. Janie had no idea how she was going to love Killicks. She didn't have any idea how or what that idea meant. She was being married off into an idea that she didn't really have any understanding of. But as it says in the text, she resolved herself to do the absolute best that she could, or to absolutely love Killicks. And later, right in that same section in the text, which is right around page 21, they're married in Nanny's parlor, but that means it lacks pomp and circumstance. It isn't a big idea then for Janie in the novel. What struck me even more from this was the description of the wagon ride after the wedding, where it says, to a lonely place like the seat of the wagon was like a lonely place, like a stump in the middle of the woods, specifically off page 21. But even the feeling, using nature, that Janie describes the wagon ride after she's married, jumps out at me as being lonely, somewhat desolate, isolated, certainly. This sense of isolation would allow me to talk about how this ties to American modernism. And then the next thing it says, it didn't say anything to match up with Nanny's gladness either. So Janie seems broken's not the right idea, but certainly at odds with the environment and the specific expectations placed upon her. At this point in the text, with her being married, the joy that's supposed to come with it, the fact that Janie has none, that she feels broken by all of this. So again, that seems significant. Now at 5 minutes and 4 seconds, a little power pause here. When you're looking in your notes and you're jotting these things down, focus on Janie's character development. What this is saying about her specifically as she moves through the text and how this affects her growth as a character. Really, that's where I want you to focus your notes in this last work of the first semester, or the last major novel. So, all this seems extraordinarily important. Now, a little bit later, Janie asks for a little information. So she comes to see Nanny, and she asks for information. Now, this is interesting because I think she's trying to find a way to cope. She's trying to find a way to struggle in an environment where she has been isolated, where she is lost. Connect this to some of those ideas that we see in your list of American modernism traits. Matter of fact, right now is when you should go back to those traits, pause the video and say, how does Janie's condition match up with some of the isolation and disillusionment that comes in those traits? So perhaps you want to do that right now. So Janie comes for a little information, and she reveals, no, I'm not pregnant. No, Killix doesn't beat me. So two of the major reasons why we would look at a failed relationship between Janie and Killix are absent here. So there's got to be something else that's missing. And you augment this by the fact that Killix is an all-around pretty good guy in this. As it says in the text, he carries water, he brings in the wood. Nanny comments that he treats her as an equal. Don't think that's accidental, because that defines the male-female dynamic as we're looking at this. It's not really the turn of the century, but close enough going into the 20th century as an idea, and certainly an odd look at how male and female relationships work. So that might be another layer to where you're going to take your notes. So it's very strange, at least Nanny says, that it's strange that he does everything that he's supposed to do to show his love for Janie, but she's still upset. She's still lost, isolated, emotionally alone. Might be a good way to put this in the notes. So again, significant. I had to read my notes for a second. So Janie doesn't want him. So from the very beginning, this is not something that's going to build her as a character. And as it says in the text, she doesn't want him, but she wants something. And again, I think this whole novel is about that search for what that something is. And I can't tell you right now if it's a person, although I tend to think that it's not. It's probably a larger idea that Janie needs to sort of fulfill where she is and where her thoughts are, etc., etc. So certainly some ideas, food for thought. Now, that was page 1 of my notes. Move on a little bit further, and in the text, Granny tells Janie not to worry. Even though Janie is lonely, she doesn't have the vision. She can't see the long view. And this probably is why Granny is significant as a character. She has the long view. You're not in love now, but it becomes really important the longer you stay in that. Don't get caught up in this fragile mentality that you have to shift from one thing to another. Stay the course. Try. It may not be wonderful now, but it will get better. It will move forward. Janie doesn't have the vision that Nanny does. Very important. Nanny gives advice about how to maintain this relationship. But I find it even more interesting in the next scene. But Nanny, she stayed on her knees so long she forgot she was there herself. So she goes and she prays. And she prays and she calls to God and says, please step in and save Janie from being lost, from this internal turmoil that her character is going through. So Nanny seems to be extraordinarily versed, extraordinarily in tune with what's going on with Janie. And as I wrote down, I'm struck by the line, quote, there is a basin in the mind where words float around in thought and sound and sight. Let me retry that. It says there is a basin in the mind where words float around on thought on sound and sight. To comment on how the emotions work. So for a third time, the quote is, there is a basin in the mind where words float around on thought. And in that same basin, thought floats around on sound and sight. So we marry our minds in the images in our head with feelings, and we tie those feelings to sound, sights, sensory imagery that we perceive. So a modern reflection on the psychology of how the mind deals with emotions. And again, huge idea right there for you. What does this say about the emotional journey that Janie is on? That's my defining question for this segment of this presentation, 12 minutes and 5 seconds by my clock. What does this connection, this quote, there is a basin in the mind where words float around on thought and thought on sound and sight. What does this say about the emotional journey that Janie is on? Now, I've said it 3 times, so I'm thinking that you want to have that down in your notes. There's a depth of thought that Janie seems to have as a character. Intuition over reason, certainly. One of your romanticist characteristics. There's a depth of thought untouched by words, and deeper still, a grief of formless feelings untouched by thought. Just like that last quote, this is another very interesting tweaking from the novel, plucking it, I guess you would say. Or thought. There is a depth of thought untouched by words, and deeper still, a gulf of formless feelings untouched by thought. I would suggest that this says there are so many feelings that characters experience, people experience, that there aren't words to explain what's going on. What if this describes Janie's development? That she can't yet put words to these enormous feelings and thoughts that she's having. Janie's supposed to have somebody to help her through this process. But to further our ideas of modernism, she's alone because Granny dies at the end of the month. Shortly after this incident, Granny dies. Thoughts I want you to think about as you go through this novel. Did Granny give up? Was the fight too much that she just couldn't handle it anymore and she had to move on? Is this a reflection on the fact that Janie might be too difficult? That Janie's struggles are not going to be fixable? What does Granny's hopelessness reveal about the theme and direction of the novel? So 3 questions. Did Granny give up? Is Janie difficult? Too difficult for Nanny? Sorry, I went to Granny on that. Is Janie so difficult that Nanny can't help her And what does Nanny's hopelessness imply about the theme of the novel? About benevolence of God and God reaching out and saying, these are significant things. What does it say about the overall direction? How does it tie to modernism? So several different pieces that you can write down that might take you further. Now, I wrote down in my notes that I wanted to read the last paragraph of chapter 3, because I think, again, this is going to make some very significant commentary. And my notes are, think about Janie's romantic view as we approach this particular last segment of chapter 3. Chapter 4 is coming up at the next part of this video. And since I'm at 15 minutes, 16 minutes exactly, that makes sense. So Janie waited a bloom time and a green time and an orange time. But when the pollen again gilded the sun and sifted down on the world, she began to stand around the gate and expect things. Make a connection between that pollen that seems to be coating everything and the expectations of the next step. I think there's some energy that's in there worth thinking about. What things? She didn't know exactly. Her breath was gusty and short. She knew things that nobody had ever told her. Anticipation, intuition, charged with an energy that she can't explain. For instance, the words of the trees and the wind. She often spoke to falling seeds and said, I hope you fall on soft ground, because she had heard seeds saying that to each other as they passed. She knew the world was a stallion rolling in the blue pasture of ether. The world was a stallion running through the air, running through the universe. Ether is like the atmosphere. She knew that God tore down the old world every evening and built a new one by sunup. It was wonderful to see it take form with the sun and emerge from the gray dust of its making. The familiar people and things had failed her, so she hung over the gate and looked up the road towards way off. She knew now that marriage did not make love. Janie's first dream was dead, so she became a woman. So, filled in this moment of anticipation, she has the blatant, clear understanding that the world is not in her favor, that these emotionally charged ideas that she believes so wholeheartedly don't make lives. All of this anticipation doesn't create love. And that awareness that she is simply a piece of the universe gives her maturity, opens her eyes to the blatant and open hostility of the modern world. As we look at chapter 4, just like I've been doing with all these chapters that we're covering in Their Eyes Were Watching God, again, dramatically holding it here. Long before the year was up, Janie noticed her husband had stopped talking in rhymes to her. And then he says later on that page, you done been spoiled rotten. That somehow Janie's lack of work, Janie's romantic tendency, the fact that Janie isn't going to simply give in and be some sort of weak servant to Kylix becomes a significant idea, I think, in the text. Very important. He says, you done been spoiled rotten. And I think the text describes this rather interestingly. He held his wad of tobacco real still in his jaw, like a thermometer of his feelings. So we have a strong female protagonist at the center of this novel, but what becomes even more significant is how that development of her character is in conflict with Killix and what he expects from the marriage. And this kind of goes a long way to define why Janie might be an extremely strong character. So Janie turns to nature. So instead of being angry and really upset, and so it says, so instead of the taters, which doesn't make sense when I'm looking at my notes. But what's significant is, but springtime reached her and filled her with this sense of probability, this sense of emotion, this sense of potential, not probability, fills her with this sense of potential. And this is on page 27 in the text. And I really think she's mesmerized by the cityfied, stylish dressed man who now all of a sudden comes in and offers an alternative, a contrast to Killix and the type of character he is and what he represents in these old ways of what's expected of Janie and how she's required to behave, etc., etc. So I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff there. So she's memorized by the cityfied, stylish dressed man that didn't belong in these parts. So somebody comes in from the outside and completely absorbs Janie's attention. And this becomes, I think, the central part of chapter 4. Because this, of course, is going to be Joe Starks. And his role is significant. We introduce Tea Cake early in the text, but he's not even around during this particular part. So again, something really significant to pay attention to. So this introduction of Joe Starks, he comes in, he says, I've saved money, I've worked my whole life for white people. He's drawn to a town down in Florida made out of nothing but colored folks. So this sort of, I forget what the term is historically called, but it's a notoriously colored community. And that becomes sort of the central point for the next portion of the novel, that Janie and Joe Starks relocate to this very specific environment. And we got to see if Janie gets to develop in the context of how all of this works. And as soon as Stark says that Janie shouldn't be doing all that manual labor, that she shouldn't be giving up what she believes in, and you could really make an argument that she shouldn't be giving up on her emotional approach to everything, she's all in. Starks offers her the right language, the right environment. It is a complete contrast, a paradox. Remember, Paradox. A paradox to what Killix offered. It's a paradox to what Granny or Nanny wanted Janie to be set up with. So Starks' emotional stability, while it might be somewhat boring, he represents that emotional stability. Starks comes in and offers her this emotional flash of, wow, this is different. You can be everything that you want to be if you just come with me. So on page 29, the whole tone changes, and it says that Joe aims to steal Janie from, actually what I wrote is, on page 29, Joe aims to steal Janie May Killix, because they have that whole thing where she talks about, I was this, now I'm this, and the idea of naming becomes very, very important. Might want to pay attention to that as we move through this a little bit. The fact that Janie very specifically stands up and says, this is the idea. So Janie puts words to Killix's deepest fears. So the conversation that Janie has with her husband after Joe Starks leaves, I think is probably more telling than a lot of this. The idea that Janie's a free spirit. She can't be sort of harnessed, and Killix has to face the deepest fear that she was never going to be good enough. Or, let me rephrase that. Has to face the fear that he's never going to be good enough, that Janie is far too much of an emotional character. The text calls her a stallion, this uncontrolled energy that Killix can't ever hope to be able to deal with. So, vibrant character in these first 4 chapters. And again, I think this sets the tone, because as we see in modernist novels, there's going to be a crisis moment where characters are either broken or they get the opportunity to transcend that problem and become stronger. They're either broken or they transcend. Broken or transcend. This is where you take that opportunity to write this material down in your notes so that you have it. I might even ask it of you in the question that follows this video presentation. On a negative point, Janie is a victim of her own desires. So while it's all well and good and vibrantly builds who she is, she can very easily become victimized by her own desires. The unknown emotions, the uncontrolled feelings that she's having, whether it's freedom, whether it's love, whether it's romance, whichever of those feelings she's really experiencing here, she can easily become a victim of her own desires. Remember, this goes to theme and to the larger conflict of emotion versus... Wait a minute, what was that idea? It's emotion versus something. Oh yeah, it's emotion versus logic, which is a central element that I've been really trying to hammer this entire semester. You know, that idea of love versus stability, emotion versus the stability of being a comfortable, very specific person. So I think that's, again, just as relevant of an idea. Janie's major act of defiance comes on page 31 in the text. And again, here's my book. Defiance is on 31, because this is going to set up the idea that Janie has to go, that there's nothing there for her any longer. So as I'm looking at my notes right here, as Janie says to Killix, this is the second to last paragraph, big paragraph on page 31. She says, "You's mad because I don't fall down and wash up these 60 acres of ground you got. You ain't done me no favor by marrying me. And if that's what you call yourself doing, I don't thank you for it. You're mad because I'm telling you what you already know." Now, I've changed some of the vernacular on that a little bit, but it's still very significant. Janie has a sense of self-awareness, I think, here in Act 3 already. I think she starts with this. It's important to probably identify whether or not she keeps this as an idea, this concept of defiance. But again, I think extraordinarily important for how we want to develop these ideas. You're mad because I'm telling you what you already know. Always a tough thing to come to this sense of self-awareness. And if you look, Logan dropped his shovel and made 2 or 3 clumsy steps towards the house and stopped abruptly. And there's some words there that he says, calls her a royal pain in the rear, and he's going to take the axe and kill you with it, right there on the bottom of the page. This is all the impetus Janie needs to leave. And so that's exactly what Joe Starks wanted. This is exactly where Janie has to move to take that next step in her development as a character. If I look at 33 as the last part of where this is, where I think all of this goes. last big paragraphs on the bottom of 32. The morning road air was like a new dress that made her feel the apron tied around her waist. She untied it and flung it on a low bush beside the road and walked on, picking flowers and making a bouquet. So she throws off the domesticity of that constraint of that apron, and she turns again to the flowers of nature. She throws off the marital role that she's been trapped in, and she goes back again to the flowers. After that, she came to where Joe Starks was waiting for her with a hired rig, with a wagon. He was very solemn and helped her to the seat beside him. With him on it, it sat like some high ruling chair. Highlight that line. With him on it, it sat like some high ruling chair. Compare that specifically in your notes to the description of riding in the wagon after her marriage to Killix. And note the difference between the energy in those two particular things. Her old thoughts were going to come in handy now, but new words would have to be made and said to fit them. Green Cove Springs, he told the drivers, so they were married there before sundown, just like Joe had said, with new clothes of silk and wool. So what is in her head as this romantic dream now becomes a reality, at least for now. In the last portion, it says, they sat on the boarding house porch and saw the sun plunge into the same crack in the earth from which the night emerged. And we end with this nature image of the sun going down into the same place where the darkness was. Look at the metaphor there. Something wonderful now replaces that darkness for at least the moment in the text. So I'm at 13 minutes and 25 seconds in this portion of your video. Read chapter 5 for class on Tuesday, this last Tuesday before we go on break for Thanksgiving. So you want to make sure you have that. My plan is to cover chapter 5 and to get into chapter 6. I also think you need to prepare for some sort of an analysis quiz where we cover this information on Tuesday. So if you can do those particular kinds of things, this is going to be a good lesson. And I think my shirt, even though you're reading it backwards, tends to capture my sentiment at some time. So with that, you have a good rest of your day, and make sure you polish up this work.